The story begins in the quiet, dust-swept plains of rural Kansas in 1887, where life was hard, simple, and often short. Families clung tightly together, relying on faith, farming, and one another to survive. It was during this time that the Whitford family decided to commission what should have been an ordinary family portrait, the kind of photo meant to capture legacy, to preserve memory, to freeze in time a moment of unity. The family gathered in their small farmhouse, dressed in their best Sunday clothes. The parents stood firm, their children clustered close, while the village photographer carefully set up his heavy, brass-lensed camera. Yet, what was supposed to be a record of love and kinship would become something far darker, a photograph whispered about for decades, a story that has never quite lost its unsettling power. For in that sepia-toned portrait, one detail would send shivers through anyone who dared to look too long. The eyes of the youngest child, though known to be dead before the shutter clicked, seemed to move. At first, no one wanted to believe it. It had been a tragic winter. Illness swept through the countryside, taking many lives, including that of 6-year-old Clara Whitford. She had been the light of the family, a spirited child with golden hair and a mischievous smile. When she passed, the grief was unbearable. Yet in the 19th century, it was not uncommon to include the deceased in family portraits. It was called post-mortem photography, a way for families to preserve one final image of their loved ones, dressed and posed to appear alive. Clara's lifeless body was propped delicately on a chair beside her siblings. Her eyes had been carefully painted open by the photographer, a common practice meant to mimic life. But when the final plate was developed, the family noticed something strange. Clara's gaze was not fixed. In one copy of the photo, her eyes looked forward, unblinking. In another, they appeared to glance sideways. This was more than just the imperfections of old photography. The Whitfords swore that every time the photograph was viewed, Clara's expression seemed different. Neighbors who visited claimed her lips curled faintly into a smirk, or that her head tilted slightly in a way it hadn't before. Whispers spread quickly through the rural community. Was the child alive when the portrait was taken? Had she stirred, however faintly, in the seconds before the shutter closed? Or worse, was something unnatural at play, some lingering presence refusing to release its hold on the little girl's body? In 1887, superstition clung to rural life as tightly as the prairie dust. Death was common, but so too were beliefs in restless spirits, curses, and signs from beyond. The photograph soon became a source of dread. It was said that animals recoiled at it, that children cried when they saw Clara's shifting eyes, and that one farmhand refused to remain in the Whitford house after glancing at it, claiming he heard the faint sound of giggles in the silence. The family themselves grew increasingly fearful. Clara's mother insisted the photograph was changing, that her daughter's face softened into expressions of sorrow, then anger, then something unrecognizable. Her father locked the portrait away in a chest, but still, when retrieved months later, Clara's eyes seemed alive, glimmering faintly under the lamplight. Some suggested it was nothing but the tricks of poor photography, of light catching varnish or shadows shifting on old glass. But others, especially the townsfolk who believed in signs from the dead, insisted it was evidence of something far more disturbing. For Clara Whitford had not been ready to leave, and through the camera's eye, she lingered, her restless spirit etched forever onto the plate, her gaze moving long after her body had gone still. The origins of Clara's portrait soon became a matter of both fascination and fear. Rural Kansas was not untouched by the era's fascination with spiritualism, the belief that the living could contact the dead through mediums, seances, and otherworldly signs. Photographs, with their uncanny ability to capture what the human eye might miss, were often thought to reveal more than simple likenesses. Some claimed that cameras could trap spirits, binding their image to the world of the living. When the Whitford portrait began showing Clara's eyes shifting, whispers of spirit photography spread among neighbors. Such images had already gained notoriety in the decades after the Civil War, when grieving families desperately sought proof of their loved ones' continued presence. But in those cases, faint figures or ghostly blurs were expected. What made the Whitford portrait unique and horrifying was that Clara's changes were not subtle. The movement was within her face itself, as if the child had resisted her frozen state in death and clawed her way into an eternal, uncanny half-life on paper. Travelers who passed through the village were shown the photograph, and accounts began circulating far beyond Kansas. A local preacher warned his congregation that the portrait was an abomination, a sign that the family had meddled too closely with death. Yet others argued it was a miracle, a message that Clara's soul remained present, watching. But even those who clung to faith struggled to look at the photograph for long. The more one stared, the more disturbing the details became. Her skin, pale and waxen, appeared normal at first glance, but shadows under her eyes seemed to deepen with each viewing. Her lips, painted with care by the photographer to mimic a natural flush, took on an unsettling curve as though she might speak at any moment. And always those eyes. They were never the same twice. The photographer, a man named Elias Turner, was summoned repeatedly to explain the bizarre qualities of the portrait. He defended his craft, insisting that double exposures, poor lighting, or chemical reactions in the developing process could not account for what the family described. Turner was no stranger to post-mortem photography, having staged dozens of such images in his career, but he admitted that Clara's was the only one that unsettled even him. "It is as if the child knew," he reportedly confessed in a letter decades later, "and tried to tell me something while I held the shutter." That letter, preserved in a historical society archive, remains one of the few first-hand accounts of the unease surrounding the photo. The Whitfords, meanwhile, became increasingly isolated. Children at school whispered that Clara haunted their classmates, appearing at windows or calling from the fields. Farmers swore they saw a small figure darting near the family barn at night, her golden hair glinting faintly under the moonlight. Even within the Whitford home, the portrait seemed to radiate dread. Lamps flickered when placed near it, and guests swore they heard scratching from inside the chest where it was stored. The family debated destroying the photograph, but Clara's mother begged them not to, clinging to it as her only tangible connection to her daughter. Yet her grief soon twisted into obsession. She was often found late at night, sitting with the photograph propped before her, murmuring as though in conversation with the child. When asked what she was doing, she would only reply, "She's still here. She's trying to come back." By the winter of 1887, the Whitford portrait had taken on a life of its own. The family's farmhouse became the center of hushed conversation across rural Kansas. Neighbors, already steeped in superstition, began to avoid the home, whispering that a curse had settled over the Whitfords since Clara's burial. Mail deliveries grew infrequent, and friends who once gathered for Sunday dinners now crossed to the other side of the road when passing the property. The family's livestock suffered strange maladies. Cows refused to give milk, chickens stopped laying eggs, and the farm's only horse was found dead in its stall, eyes wide open as if it had seen something unspeakable. The Whitfords attributed it all to misfortune, yet those who knew of the photograph blamed Clara. Inside the home, the atmosphere thickened with dread. Clara's siblings, two younger boys, refused to sleep in their rooms, complaining of hearing small footsteps in the hall at night. On several occasions, they swore they saw Clara's shadow moving independently of anyone else's. Their father, hardened by farm work and known for his skepticism, initially dismissed these fears as childish nonsense. But even he could not ignore the night. He entered the parlor to find the portrait, which had been carefully locked away in a trunk, propped upright on the mantelpiece. No one in the family admitted to retrieving it. His anger gave way to fear when he noticed the change in the child's expression. Her eyes, once glassy and lifeless, now seemed fixed on him with unmistakable intent. Word of the portrait's eerie qualities eventually reached a traveling preacher named Reverend Amos Clark, a stern figure known for his fiery sermons against spiritual corruption. He insisted on visiting the Whitfords, determined to rid them of what he called a devil's mark. When he arrived, he demanded to see the photograph himself. The family hesitated, but Clara's mother, trembling, exhausted, and strangely eager, brought it forth. The Reverend reportedly recoiled after only a glance. "That child's gaze follows me," he muttered, sweat beading on his forehead. He attempted to bless the portrait, sprinkling it with holy water and reading aloud from his Bible. Yet as he did so, witnesses swore Clara's faint painted lips curled into the barest suggestion of a smile. The Reverend stopped mid-verse, his voice faltering, before slamming the book shut. He declared the photograph a vessel unfit for this earth and urged the Whitfords to burn it immediately. But the family refused. Clara's mother clutched the photograph to her chest, sobbing that it was all she had left. The Reverend, visibly shaken, left the farmhouse without another word, and it is said he never preached in that county again. His sudden silence only fueled the whispers spreading through the community. People began to speak of the Whitfords as cursed, their farm avoided like a plague house. Yet still, the photograph endured, its image quietly altering with each retelling. Some who glimpsed it described Clara's head tilting slightly. Others insisted her eyes gleamed faintly in lamplight, as though she were waiting for something or someone. By early spring, the photograph of Clara had become more than just a family relic. It had become a source of obsession. Her mother, once a lively woman who hosted quilting bees and gatherings with the other farm wives, now withdrew almost entirely into the parlor. She sat for hours beneath the portrait, rocking in silence, eyes fixed on Clara's frozen stare. Some nights, neighbors passing by swore they could see a dim glow from the window, long after the lamps should have burned out, as if Clara's gaze itself radiated through the glass. Her father, increasingly unsettled, tried to hide the photo again, once in the cellar, once in the barn loft, but each time it somehow found its way back onto the mantel, as though the child demanded a place of honor among the living. Clara's brothers began to speak less and less, their play replaced by a nervous watchfulness. One of them, just 6 years old, confessed to a neighbor that his sister had spoken to him through the glass, that she told him not to be afraid, that she was still here. The other boy, a little older, refused to sleep entirely, pacing at night and muttering that Clara's eyes were no longer still in the picture. "She's looking for someone," he whispered, though he would not say who. The father tried to beat sense into the boys, but even his anger carried no weight against the atmosphere in the home. The Whitfords, once respected and even envied for their land, were now regarded as an omen, a family carrying something unnatural within their walls. It was during this period that the photograph began to show undeniable changes. Not subtle illusions, not tricks of flickering lamplight, but alterations too stark to dismiss. A visiting cousin swore that Clara's left eye had shifted ever so slightly between glances, angling downward toward him when moments earlier it had been fixed straight ahead. Another insisted her pupils grew larger when the room was darkened, like the eyes of a living child adjusting to shadows. Each account was met with skepticism until, one evening, Clara's father gathered his sons and his wife to witness it themselves. With a single candle lit, he raised the portrait high. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. But then, unmistakably, the faintest twitch rippled across the painted shine of her eyes. Her gaze darted, quick as a blink, toward the youngest boy. The family froze. The mother gasped and clutched her son. The father, pale and trembling, lowered the portrait but could not bring himself to destroy it. Fear and love warred within him, the terror of what he had seen clashing with his desperate refusal to let go of the last image of his daughter. From that night forward, the Whitford home was never quiet. Doors creaked open on their own. The sound of small footsteps echoed in the hall at impossible hours. And always, the portrait seemed to be watching, recording, and waiting for the living to acknowledge it. The weeks that followed turned the Whitford farmstead into a place of whispered dread. Neighbors, already uneasy, began avoiding the family altogether. The blacksmith's wife, who once visited often, refused to even walk past their lane. She claimed that whenever she drew near, she could feel someone staring from the upper window, a pair of eyes that did not belong to the mother, nor to the boys, but to a child who should not have been there. Stories spread quickly in small rural towns, And soon the Whitfords were no longer seen as grieving parents, but as cursed custodians of something that straddled the line between life and death. The children at the one-room schoolhouse teased the Whitford boys, chanting that their sister's ghost would crawl through their windows at night. One boy swore he had seen Clara, pale and barefoot, wandering the edge of the cornfield just before dusk, her white dress moving unnaturally against the wind. Inside the house, the photograph seemed to grow heavier, not physically, but in presence. It dominated the parlor, its aura seeping into every corner of the home. Clara's mother spoke to it more openly now, sometimes scolding her daughter as though she were alive, other times begging her to rest. Her father, torn between reason and terror, tried once again to remove it, carrying it to a far-off shed and locking it away. Yet by dawn, it was back on the mantel, perfectly positioned, the glass unmarred, as though it had never been touched. The family stopped speaking of it in public, but within their walls, the portrait was all-consuming. One night, a violent storm rolled across Kansas, tearing shingles from roofs and bending trees nearly to the ground. Lightning lit up the Whitford parlor again and again, and each flash revealed something worse than the last. The boys swore Clara's face was no longer frozen in her gentle, childlike expression. In one strike of light, her mouth appeared curled into a faint smile. In another, her eyes seemed to widen with unmistakable intent, locking onto her father as if acknowledging him directly. When the storm subsided and the room was left in darkness, no one dared move. The silence was broken only by the faint creak of the rocking chair, swaying back and forth though no one sat in it. By morning, the father had aged years overnight. He confided to a neighbor, one of the few who still dared to visit, that Clara was trying to return. He spoke not as a man fearing madness, but as one who had seen too much to deny. Her eyes aren't just watching anymore, he whispered. They're searching, and every night, they move closer. The neighbor, shaken, urged him to burn the photograph, but the father could not. To destroy it felt like destroying Clara herself. And so, the portrait remained, unyielding, haunting, and steadily transforming into something no longer human. By the autumn of 1887, the Whitford household was nearly unrecognizable. The once bustling farmstead grew eerily quiet, its fields overgrown and its chores neglected. It wasn't laziness that kept the family from their work, it was fear. The children no longer played outside after sunset. They refused to go upstairs alone, for they claimed that Clara's room never stayed empty. Her toys were sometimes rearranged in a circle, as if she had been sitting among them. Her bed, neatly made each morning, would be mussed and indented by nightfall. The family avoided speaking of it, yet the evidence was undeniable. But the photograph remained the greatest terror. Each day, its details seemed subtly altered, though no hand touched it. A tilt of Clara's head, a new glint in her eyes, the faintest curve of a smile. Her brothers swore that, when they lingered too long before it, they could see her pupils dilating, a slow, deliberate reaction, as though she were adjusting to the light in the room. One night, the youngest boy burst into tears when he claimed Clara had blinked at him. His father struck him for speaking such blasphemy, but even he did not dare to look directly at the photo that evening. The family began covering it with a cloth, but the covering never lasted. By dawn, it was always gone, neatly folded at the base of the mantel. The townsfolk had stopped visiting altogether, but that did not stop the rumors. Whispers spread in the general store and the church pews that Clara had not gone to the grave, but lingered in the portrait instead. That the Whitfords had bound themselves to something unnatural and were paying the price. Some even muttered of digging up the girl's coffin to prove she had not stayed buried. Then came the night that sealed their fate. As the family gathered reluctantly in the parlor, a strange hum filled the air, low at first, then rising until it seemed to vibrate through the walls themselves. The oil lamp flickered violently, nearly extinguishing, and in its dim light, Clara's eyes in the photograph began to move. Not just flicker or shift subtly as before, but track, following each family member in turn. Her gaze slid across the room like that of a living child, settling finally on her mother, who collapsed to the floor with a scream. The father rushed to her side, but froze when he saw what she was pointing at. Clara's reflection was no longer confined to the photograph. In the parlor's window, illuminated by the storm outside, stood the faint outline of a child. Her small frame was pale and indistinct, like a half-formed shadow, yet her eyes gleamed unmistakably, the same eyes that had haunted the family for months. For a moment, no one breathed. Then the rocking chair began to sway violently, banging against the floor as though someone unseen had climbed into it. The family fled the room, slamming the door behind them, but the sounds continued. The creak of the chair, the tapping on the glass, and the faint, childlike giggle that carried through the storm. From that night forward, no one in the household spoke of Clara as dead. She was no longer a memory, no longer a loss to mourn. She had become a presence. And with each passing week, her presence grew stronger, as though the boundary between the photograph and the living world was unraveling. Word of the Whitfords' troubles spread like wildfire through the dusty Kansas town. Rural life thrived on gossip, and whispers about a photograph that breathed and blinked were too sinister to ignore. Neighbors who once traded crops and cattle with the Whitfords began to distance themselves, crossing to the other side of the dirt road when passing the farmhouse. Yet curiosity gnawed at them. A few brave men ventured in one evening, determined to prove that the family was either lying or losing their minds. They returned shaken, pale as milk, refusing to speak a word about what they had seen. One of them, an older farmer named Henry Crowell, was overheard muttering to his wife, "That girl ain't in the ground no more. She's sittin' right there in that picture, staring back at you." He left town the following week, abandoning his fields and home without explanation. Others who caught even a fleeting glance of the portrait reported sleepless nights filled with the same dream. Clara standing at the foot of their bed, her eyes unblinking, her lips twitching as if she wanted to speak. The townsfolk grew increasingly superstitious. They claimed animals avoided the Whitford property, that milk soured faster within its walls, and that children cried uncontrollably if carried too close to the farmhouse. Churchgoers insisted that the family was cursed, and some demanded the reverend banish them from attending service altogether. Yet no one dared confront the Whitfords directly. The family themselves were shadows of who they once were, gaunt, hollow-eyed, moving through their days as though weighed down by unseen chains. The father stopped tending the land, and the mother's hair turned silver in only a few short months. Then came the incident with the traveling photographer. Passing through the rural county, he offered his services to families who wanted portraits, a novelty in the 1880s, when cameras were rare. Out of morbid curiosity, a few locals persuaded him to visit the Whitford home and see the infamous photograph. He agreed, dismissing their stories as backwoods hysteria. But when he entered the parlor and set his eyes upon Clara's image, he froze. According to those present, his hands trembled so violently he dropped his equipment, the glass plate shattering across the floor. He backed out of the room without a word, packed his belongings, and left town before dawn. In the weeks that followed, rumors circulated that the photographer's hair had turned white overnight. The portrait was no longer a private curse. It had become a communal wound, festering at the heart of the town. Some suggested burning the photograph, but the Whitfords refused, not out of stubbornness, but because each time they tried, something stopped them. Matches sputtered and went out. Flames caught, but left the image untouched, the frame pristine while the paper around it burned. One night, the father hurled it into the fire in a fit of rage, only to find it back on the mantel the next morning, untouched. By now, even those who had never entered the farmhouse spoke of Clara as though she were still alive. Farmers swore they had seen her on the dirt roads at twilight, walking silently, her head tilted at the same eerie angle captured in the photograph. Mothers warned their children not to wander at dusk, lest they meet the Whitford's daughter. Clara had become more than a ghost. She was becoming folklore, a living curse that seeped beyond the edges of her family's land. As Clara's legend spread through the rural Kansas countryside, the haunting ceased to be whispers and began to bleed into everyday life. The Whitford farmhouse was no longer simply avoided. It became feared, treated like a graveyard that still breathed. Crops around their fields withered while others flourished, creating a visible boundary as though the land itself rejected its owners. Travelers on horseback reported strange chills passing the property, even in the heat of summer, and one man swore he saw a girl's pale hand brush across his sleeve as he rode by, though no one stood beside the road. Inside the house, the photograph had grown unbearable. The family stopped covering it with cloth, not because they didn't want to, but because every morning, the shroud would be found neatly folded beside the frame. Clara's eyes seemed brighter, more watchful, and more than one visitor described seeing her blink in full daylight. The younger Whitford children grew silent, no longer playing or speaking freely. Instead, they sat for hours in the parlor, staring back at their sister's likeness as though locked in some unspoken communion. Soon, accidents began to plague the family. Tools fell from shelves without cause, narrowly missing heads. Lamps shattered, oil spilling dangerously close to flames. A neighbor boy who sneaked into the parlor on a dare left screaming, clawing at his eyes, insisting that Clara had leaned out of the frame and tried to touch him. He never fully recovered, and his parents sent him away to relatives in another county. The Whitfords grew increasingly isolated, but even in their solitude, they were not safe. For now, Clara's presence was no longer confined to the photograph. She was slipping into the rooms, into the very air they breathed. The breaking point came one stormy night in late autumn. Thunder rattled the windows, and the family huddled together in the parlor, too afraid to sleep. As lightning flashed across the sky, the photograph of Clara seemed to glow, her eyes following each strike. Then, without warning, the glass covering the frame splintered outward as though something inside had pressed against it. Shards scattered across the floor, slicing the father's hand as he tried to shield his children. Blood dripped onto the rug, and in the next flash of lightning, Clara's painted grin appeared wider, her teeth faintly visible. From that night forward, the haunting grew violent. Objects hurled themselves across rooms. Doors locked and unlocked on their own. The youngest Whitford child was found one morning standing outside in the rain, barefoot, whispering Clara's name as though answering a call. When asked how she got out of the house, she simply pointed at the photograph and said, "She opened the door." The townspeople had seen enough. Where once they gossiped and speculated, now they recoiled in terror. Some urged the family to leave the land entirely, abandon the house, and bury the cursed photograph deep where no one could find it. But the Whitfords were trapped by poverty, by pride, and by something far more sinister. They confessed that every attempt to remove the photograph had failed. It always returned, as if the house itself was bound to it. And now, the family began to wonder whether Clara's spirit was bound to them as well. A reminder that death in rural Kansas was not always a release, but sometimes a prison that chained the living to the dead. By winter of 1887, the Whitford farmhouse was no longer a home, but a battlefield. The walls seemed to breathe with unease, groaning at night, as though the beams themselves were weighed down by Clara's spirit. The family stopped using lanterns after several exploded without cause, showering the room in burning oil. They sat in the dark instead, whispering prayers, though even those seemed to curdle on their lips. The youngest children no longer played, no longer laughed. They simply watched the photograph, waiting for their sister to move. It was around this time that the livestock began to die. First the chickens, found strangled in their coops with no marks on their bodies. Then the cattle, who collapsed one by one in the fields, eyes wide with terror. A neighbor swore he heard the Whitfords' horses screaming through the night, though when he came to check, the animals were already stiff, their mouths foaming as though something had poisoned the very air. The family buried what animals they could, but the soil itself seemed to reject the offerings. Dogs dug the graves open within days, and the corpses always appeared twisted, their limbs bent unnaturally, as though Clara had reached from the beyond to remind them that no creature was safe. Inside the house, the portrait of Clara grew impossible to ignore. Her once faint grin had widened, showing rows of small, sharp teeth. Her eyes no longer followed only in fleeting glances. Now, they stared openly, defiant, glowing faintly even in the blackest hours of night. Guests refused to enter the home, and the family found themselves cut off from the rest of the community. It was in this suffocating isolation that the first true tragedy struck. The Whitfords' eldest son, Thomas, was the first to fall. At just 17, he had grown restless, convinced he could end the nightmare. Armed with a spade and a kerosene lamp, he attempted to burn the portrait one bitter January night while his family slept. The fire roared up quickly, consuming the frame and licking the wallpaper. But the blaze spread faster than expected, nearly catching the entire house. His screams woke the family. They rushed to find Thomas on the floor, convulsing, his hands blackened not by flame but by frost. The lamp beside him was frozen solid, its glass frosted over, though the fire still burned on the walls. He lingered for 2 days, his body writhing in fever as he cried out Clara's name. Witnesses said his final words were chilling. "She blinked for me." When he died, the fire stopped. The wallpaper repaired itself overnight, leaving no trace of the destruction. But the portrait of Clara, which the family swore had been reduced to ashes, hung once again in the parlor, pristine, untouched, with her eyes brighter than ever. Thomas's death broke the family. The mother began to waste away, eating little, her hands trembling whenever she passed the parlor door. The father grew erratic, muttering about selling the land and fleeing. Though every time he left to speak with a buyer, something happened, storms rolling in from nowhere, his horse throwing him into the mud, even a tree collapsing across the road. Each attempt ended in failure. It was as though the land itself, now poisoned by Clara's spirit, refused to let them leave. Neighbors kept their distance, but from afar they saw the lights in the farmhouse flicker each night as though something moved from room to room. And the whispers began again. Only now, they no longer asked whether Clara's eyes moved. They asked how long it would be before her family joined her in the grave. After Thomas's death, silence reigned over the Whitford home. But that silence was not peace. It was anticipation, a suffocating stillness that seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something worse. And then, the youngest daughter, Mary, only 9 years old, began to change. At first, it was subtle. She would stare too long at Clara's portrait, her lips moving as if whispering secrets to her dead sister. She stopped playing with her dolls, leaving them lined neatly against the wall, their faces turned toward the photograph. At night, she walked the halls barefoot, her nightgown dragging across the wooden planks, her small voice murmuring words no one recognized. The family assumed it was grief, but grief does not make a child's voice sound like 2 voices speaking at once. Then came the day the mother found Mary standing in the parlor in broad daylight, eyes fixed on the portrait. Her hands were clasped, her head tilted, as though in prayer. "She's still here," Mary whispered without turning. "She says I must stay with her." When her mother tried to pull her away, Mary fought with a strength no child should have possessed, twisting and clawing at the floor until her fingernails bled. The portrait had changed again. Clara's eyes no longer just followed the room. They now looked downward, directly at Mary. And worse still, the faint smile had returned, fuller than before, almost triumphant. That night, the family barred the parlor door, but they could still hear Mary inside, though she had never left her bed. Soft singing drifted from the room, a lullaby Clara used to hum before she died. As days passed, Mary's possession grew undeniable. Her once bright blue eyes darkened, taking on the same cloudy, unnatural sheen as Clara's in the photograph. She began speaking in riddles about things she could not know. The neighbor's child who had drowned years earlier, the old farmer who had been buried with a broken neck, even secrets her own parents had kept from one another. At times, she would simply sit at the dinner table, chewing nothing, her eyes glassy as though someone else peered out from behind them. One evening, as the family gathered in near darkness, Mary began to laugh. It was not the sound of a child, but a low, hollow chuckle that echoed through the wooden beams. "Do you see it?" she asked, her gaze fixed on the wall where the portrait hung. The family turned to look. There, for the first time, Clara's figure in the photograph was not sitting still. The faint blur of movement had been captured, her hand reaching out, her small fingers extending toward Mary. The parents tore the photograph from the wall that night, desperate to end it. But behind the frame, etched into the plaster, were small fingernail marks, gouged deep as though someone, or something, had been trying to claw its way out. And when they looked back at the photograph, Clara was no longer alone. Mary's reflection stood beside her, faint and blurred, smiling with the same ghastly grin. From that moment on, the Whitfords realized it wasn't merely Clara haunting the family. It was Clara recruiting. By autumn, the Whitford home had become unrecognizable. What was once a modest farmhouse filled with the chatter of children and the quiet labor of farm life had turned into a mausoleum. Curtains were kept drawn, lamps burned low, and conversations were reduced to hushed whispers. Not because the family feared being overheard, but because they feared waking something that no longer slept. Mary was the center of this dread. The girl who once braided flowers in her hair now wandered barefoot through the yard, scratching strange symbols into the dirt with sticks. At night, she sat at the edge of her bed and hummed in a voice that did not belong to her. When her brothers tried to confront her, she would stop suddenly, tilt her head at an unnatural angle, and grin in a way that froze their blood. Her father, desperate, forbade her from entering the parlor where Clara's portrait still hung, but Mary disobeyed. One night, he found her standing in the dark room, her hand pressed flat against the glass. Her reflection was not alone. Behind her, Clara's pale face seemed pressed against the inside of the photo, her eyes wide, her mouth open in a silent scream. The father yanked Mary away, only to feel a cold breath brush across his cheek, though the windows were sealed and the air still. The next day, Mary's fingernails began to fall off one by one, as though she had clawed at something no one else could see. She carried them in her pocket, rattling them like coins, whispering, "She told me to keep them for later." The violence began soon after. At supper one evening, without warning, Mary thrust a fork into her older brother's hand, driving the metal deep between his bones. She didn't laugh. She didn't cry. She only stared at him with Clara's clouded eyes and whispered, "She wants another." When confronted, Mary swore it wasn't her. "It's Clara," she insisted, her voice trembling between the innocence of a child and the cold certainty of something ancient. Her mother, now gaunt from sleepless nights, tried to hold Mary down during one of her fits, but the child's strength was inhuman. Plates flew from shelves, chairs toppled, and every window in the farmhouse shattered in unison, though no storm rattled the plains outside. The father sought the help of a traveling pastor, who arrived with little more than a Bible and a cross. But when he entered the home, Mary's face contorted into a grin so wide it split her lips. "Too late," she hissed, her voice layered, guttural, echoing as though it came from beneath the floorboards. "She already has me." And in that moment, the pastor swore he saw two shadows behind Mary, the child's own, and another, taller, thinner, with hollow eyes that moved independently of her body. Clara's portrait trembled on the wall, its frame rattling until it fell to the floor with a shattering crack. But the image did not break. Clara remained intact, her smile fixed, wider than ever. The Whitfords were no strangers to prayer, but the prayers now sounded hollow, trembling in the corners of the farmhouse like whispers drowned in storm winds. The father, Henry, desperate beyond reason, agreed to let the pastor attempt a cleansing ritual, something between an exorcism and a prayer service, cobbled together from scripture and superstition. Mary was placed in the parlor, bound to a chair with thick rope. Her skin was pale and bruised where she had clawed herself raw. Her eyes, once soft and childlike, glistened with a dull, gray sheen, as if death itself had taken residence in them. The pastor sprinkled water across her forehead, but the droplets boiled instantly, releasing a foul stench of sulfur. Mary's lips parted, and Clara's voice, unmistakably hers, the voice of the dead sister, emerged from the small, trembling body. "You buried me wrong," she hissed. "You left me in the dark." The Whitford mother collapsed into sobs. The pastor pressed his cross against Mary's forehead, but Mary screamed with laughter, thrashing against her bonds. Every oil lamp in the house flared at once, their flames stretching unnaturally high before extinguishing altogether. The room fell into absolute blackness, save for the dim glow of Mary's eyes. Two pale embers flickering in the dark. Henry lit a match with shaking hands, and in its fragile light he saw not only Mary bound in the chair, but Clara too, standing behind her. The dead girl's form was faint, translucent, yet her eyes were clear, sharp, and furious. The pastor shouted prayers louder, his voice cracking, but the walls of the farmhouse groaned as though the entire structure were alive and suffocating them. Dishes rattled in the cupboards, floorboards splintered, and a wind howled from nowhere. Mary convulsed, her voice doubling, Clara's words and hers overlapping until they became one chorus. "You can't send me back. I belong here now." The ropes frayed as if cut from the inside. Mary's hands slipped free, and with an impossible speed, she lunged forward, teeth snapping at the pastor's wrist. He recoiled, clutching his arm, pale with terror. It wasn't just the child's teeth he saw in her mouth, but an extra set, jagged and rotten, gnashing in the back of her throat. Henry screamed for it to stop, but his words dissolved in the cacophony. The portrait of Clara, which had been rehung on the wall despite his earlier attempts to destroy it, began to bleed. Thick, dark streaks seeped down the frame, dripping onto the floor in a slow, deliberate rhythm, like the ticking of a clock. The pastor fled. He left his Bible behind, open on the table, pages fluttering as if in a storm. The Whitford family was left alone with Mary, who had fallen eerily silent. She turned her head slowly toward her father and smiled. "She's not leaving," Mary whispered. "She says you're next." Henry realized, with an icy clarity, that every prayer, every ritual, every attempt to drive Clara away had not weakened her. It had invited her further in. By the spring of 1888, the Whitfords were no longer the only ones whispering about Clara. Neighbors began to speak in hushed tones of strange sights near the old farmhouse. A traveling peddler swore he saw a little girl wandering the cornfield at dusk, her dress torn and covered in dirt, her eyes shining faintly like lantern glass. He approached, thinking she was lost, but when she turned to face him, he saw her face was wrong, the features mismatched, as though another child's expression had been crudely stitched over her own. The peddler dropped his cart and ran screaming into town. Soon after, the church bell rang in the dead of night, though no one had pulled the rope. The sound echoed through the streets, each toll sharp and metallic, shaking windows until glass cracked in their frames. Families awoke in panic, rushing to their porches only to see shadows moving in the fog. The shadows always seemed to center on one figure, a small child with long braids who stood silently at the edge of the road, watching the town before vanishing. In the Whitford home, Mary grew weaker by the day. She no longer ate, no longer slept, yet her body remained disturbingly animate. At times she spoke in riddles, at times in Latin verses she could never have known. Her siblings avoided her now, huddling together at night while she sat at the foot of their bed, staring with eyes that were not her own. When their mother tried to comfort them, Mary would mimic her voice, perfectly, uncannily, and whisper, "Hush, I'll keep you safe," before giggling in Clara's familiar laugh. Word spread fast. The town, deeply religious and prone to superstition, began to fear not only Clara's ghost but the Whitford family themselves. Rumors swirled that Henry had made a pact, that Mary was a demon in a child's body, that the land itself was cursed. People crossed the street to avoid them, and soon even the pastor who had once tried to help refused to step near their door. But Clara was not content with whispers. She wanted witnesses. One evening, the town gathered for Sunday service. Just as the pastor lifted his voice in prayer, the church lamps flickered out. For a full minute, the sanctuary sat in suffocating darkness. When the lamps flared back to life, the congregation gasped, because sitting in the front pew, where no one had been before, was a little girl. She looked drenched, her skin pale and swollen as though she had been pulled from a river. Her eyes rolled back white, yet she smiled with an expression far too knowing. Children screamed. Mothers clutched them tight, but when they looked again, the pew was empty. The only evidence of the girl's presence was the puddle of muddy water spreading across the wooden floor. That night, the town descended into chaos. Doors were bolted shut. Men patrolled with lanterns and rifles, yet none dared to approach the Whitford farm. It was said that the fields whispered now, carrying voices in the rustling corn. Some swore they saw Clara's figure standing on the roof. Others claimed she drifted through the barn walls as if they weren't solid at all. Inside the farmhouse, Henry knew they had lost control. His daughter was no longer just a vessel. She was a beacon. Clara was feeding, spreading, pulling the entire community into her grasp. And Henry realized, with the weight of despair crushing him, that Clara's vengeance would not stop with their family. It had only begun. By midsummer of 1888, fear had hardened into anger. The townsfolk, once sympathetic to the Whitfords' grief, now whispered that their sorrow had poisoned the land. The corn around their farmhouse wilted even while neighboring fields flourished. Cows miscarried their calves, wells turned cloudy, and children in town awoke screaming about a girl with drowned eyes standing at their windows. It was too much to ignore. The pastor, his voice trembling, preached that the Whitfords had invited corruption into their home. "The devil," he cried from the pulpit, "wears the mask of innocence. He walks among us in the shape of a child." Though he never spoke Clara's name aloud, everyone in the pews knew. They turned their gaze toward the Whitfords' empty seats, and their silence carried an unspoken verdict. Soon, the family was treated as outcasts. When Henry came into town for supplies, merchants refused to serve him. Women pulled their children inside, shutters slammed, and even lifelong neighbors crossed themselves as he passed. Once, a group of boys hurled stones at his wagon, screaming that he was a soul thief. He bore the insults quietly, but his hollow eyes betrayed a man unraveling. Inside the farmhouse, tension grew unbearable. Mary's episodes worsened. She sometimes collapsed into violent seizures, her body bending at impossible angles before stiffening like a corpse. Yet moments later she would rise calmly and ask for supper as though nothing had happened. Henry's wife, worn thin by sleepless nights, whispered that they should leave the farm, but Henry shook his head. "Clara wouldn't let us go," he muttered. And the truth was, he was right. Every attempt to pack, every effort to leave, ended with disaster. Broken wagons, sudden fires, storms that struck only their path. The Whitfords were trapped, and the town had decided they were no longer victims but the source of the curse. The breaking point came when a young boy from town vanished. He had been walking home after dusk when he failed to arrive. A search party combed the roads and riverbanks but found nothing, except, hours later, his cap, sodden and muddy, lying just outside the Whitford fence line. Panic ignited like dry tinder. By morning, townsfolk stormed the Whitford property with lanterns and rifles. They shouted accusations, demanding Henry release the boy's spirit. The family, terrified, barred the door while Mary shrieked in a voice not her own, "He's mine now." The mob, shaken by the sound, nearly set fire to the farmhouse, but the pastor intervened at the last moment, insisting they wait for proof. Still, the damage was done. The Whitfords were branded as cursed, guilty, damned. No one came near their land after nightfall, yet rumors spread that ghostly lights flickered in the windows, that shadows moved inside even when the family slept. Some swore the missing boy's laughter echoed from the barn. Henry knew the truth, though he could not admit it aloud. Clara was growing stronger. She was pulling not only at Mary but at the town itself, weaving herself into their fear. And the more they feared, the more real she became. In the silence of the farmhouse, Henry sat at the kitchen table with his head in his hands, listening to his daughter's soft humming upstairs. It was Clara's lullaby, the one she used to sing to herself before bed. Except Clara had been dead for nearly a year. And yet, her song filled every corner of the house, sweet and chilling, as though she had never left. By the fall of 1888, the town's patience had rotted into vengeance. Whispers in the tavern turned to plans, and plans turned to open threats. The sheriff, once sympathetic, confessed quietly to Henry, "I can't protect you anymore. People want this ended, one way or another." The Whitford farm became a prison. Windows were nailed shut, doors bolted, lanterns burning through the night as though light alone could ward off the dark. But light could not stop what came creeping in the silence. Clara's presence was no longer confined to Mary. Furniture scraped across the floor at midnight. Silverware clattered as though hurled by invisible hands. Once, Henry's wife woke screaming that cold, tiny fingers had closed around her throat. The final straw came during Sunday service. As the congregation knelt in prayer, the church bell tolled 13 times, a number no ringer would strike. When the townsfolk rushed outside, they swore they saw the faint silhouette of a girl, Mary's size, Clara's shape, standing high in the belfry, staring down at them. By the time they stormed the tower, it was empty. That night, the pastor gathered men at the tavern. Their verdict was unanimous. The Whitfords must be brought before the town. If Clara's spirit lingered, it needed banishment or destruction. Fear had twisted into righteousness. They told themselves they weren't punishing the family, but saving the town. So it was that one moonless evening. A mob marched toward the farm with torches and ropes. Their shadows stretched long against the fields, their boots striking the earth in grim unison. Mary saw them first through the window and began shrieking, not in her voice, but Clara's. "They'll never take me," she howled, eyes rolling back until only the whites showed. Henry, clutching his rifle, stood trembling at the door. He had lost his daughter once, and he was not prepared to lose her again, even if what lived in Mary was no longer Clara. The mob surrounded the house. Torchlight painted the walls in molten orange as fists pounded on the door. "Bring the girl out," they shouted. "End this curse." Inside, Henry's wife clung to Mary, who laughed with a voice too deep for her age. It was the laugh of something older, hungrier. Henry begged through the door. "She's just a child. Leave us be." But the townsfolk would not listen. Fear had robbed them of mercy. One man hurled a stone, shattering the window, and through the jagged glass Clara's face appeared, not Mary's, but Clara's pale, dirt-streaked visage. Her eyes glowed faintly, as though catching firelight from within. The crowd gasped, some crossing themselves, others raising their torches higher. The pastor stepped forward, voice cracking with both fear and authority. "This is no child of God. This is the devil's trick. Burn it out." His words ignited the crowd. Torches were raised against the farmhouse walls. Flames licked at the timber, smoke curling into the night. Inside, chaos reigned. Mary convulsed, screaming Clara's name, while Henry's wife tried to smother the growing fire with water. Henry himself aimed his rifle out the window, firing into the air in a desperate attempt to scatter the mob. But fear had made them immovable. They surged closer, chanting, demanding release from the evil they believed the Whitfords had birthed. And then, as the fire threatened to consume the farmhouse, everything went still. The laughter stopped. Mary stood, calm and unblinking, her eyes locked on her father's. "It's not them, Papa," she whispered in Clara's voice. "It's me. I never left." The torches outside hissed in the sudden silence, their flames guttering as if a great breath had blown across the night. For a heartbeat, the mob froze, gripped by something colder than fire. Henry realized then that the battle was no longer against the townsfolk. It was against his own blood. The farmhouse groaned as flames crept along its beams, sparks falling like fiery snow. Smoke pressed against the ceiling, curling into corners where shadows twisted unnaturally. Outside, the mob chanted louder, their voices a relentless drumbeat of fear and fury. Inside, time seemed suspended, every moment stretched thin between life and death. Mary stood at the center of it all, too calm for a child in such chaos. Her small hands dangled at her sides, and yet the weight of her gaze pressed upon the room like an invisible storm. Her father, rifle still in hand, couldn't bring himself to lift it against her. His wife sobbed quietly behind him, clutching a wet cloth to her face to block out the smoke. Then Mary spoke again. "You buried me in the dark, Papa," she said in Clara's unmistakable voice. "You left me cold and alone. But I found a way back." Her lips curved into a smile far too cruel for an 8-year-old girl. Henry staggered, his throat tightening. He knew then, with a dreadful certainty, that this was not a trick of grief or fever. Something had clawed its way back from the grave and found a vessel in his surviving daughter. The rafters above cracked, raining ash and embers. Each sound made the mob outside cheer louder, as if the collapsing house would prove their righteousness. But inside, The Whitfords were trapped in something far darker than fire. Mary's steps were slow, deliberate, as she moved toward her father. With each step, the room grew colder, the flames bending away from her as though afraid to touch her. "Will you bury me again?" she asked, tilting her head. "Or will you keep me this time?" Henry's grip on the rifle faltered. He could feel his wife's eyes on him, pleading for action, begging him to save their daughter, or what was left of her. The decision weighed heavier than the smoke in his lungs. If he fired, he would end Clara's hold on Mary, but he would also end Mary. If he did nothing, the thing inside her would consume them all. Suddenly, Mary's body convulsed violently, her back arching as her head snapped upward. Her eyes rolled back, but then slowly returned, two different gazes staring from one face. One eye glowed faintly, Clara's, while the other looked wide and terrified, Mary's. She was fighting inside her own skin. "Papa, help me." Mary's voice broke through, desperate and trembling. Then, in the same breath, Clara's rasp followed. "No, Papa, don't listen. I am your daughter. I am all you have left." The voices layered, echoing against each other until Henry couldn't tell them apart. His knees buckled as he lowered the rifle, torn apart by love and terror. His wife fell to her knees beside Mary, clutching her, crying out prayers between sobs. But when she touched the girl's face, the skin burned her palms as though she had pressed against hot iron. A crash from the kitchen sent a door flying open, wind and smoke swirling inside. The fire was spreading faster now, and the mob outside pressed closer, some shouting to drag the family out by force. But none dared enter. Whatever lived inside that farmhouse was not theirs to confront. Mary's small hands reached out toward her father, trembling. One was soft, human. The other looked gray and rigid, as though pulled from the grave. "Choose," she whispered, her two voices tangled as one. "Choose me, or lose us both." Henry's finger tightened on the trigger. His tears streaked down soot-stained cheeks as the house crackled, threatening to collapse. The choice, he knew, would damn him forever, whether he acted or not. The rifle felt like molten iron in Henry's hands, every breath searing his lungs with smoke and indecision. Mary stood only a few feet away, her face flickering in the orange light, sometimes the innocent daughter he had raised, sometimes the corpse-pale specter of Clara, her eyes alight with a hunger that was not human. The mob outside shouted for fire and cleansing, their words muffled beneath the roaring blaze. But inside, the world was reduced to the girl before him and the weight of his finger against the trigger. "Papa," Mary whimpered, her true voice breaking through again. She was crying, her cheeks streaked with tears that cut pale lines through the soot. "Please, don't let her take me." Her body spasmed again, jerking unnaturally as Clara's voice slithered out. "Shoot, and you bury them both. Do nothing, and she becomes me. Which death will you choose, Papa?" His wife clung to his arm, her nails digging into his skin. "Henry," she sobbed, "you can't kill her. You can't kill our baby girl." Her eyes searched his, frantic, desperate. But Henry's gaze never left Mary. He saw the truth. His daughter was slipping away, her small body tearing between life and something else. The longer he waited, the more Clara consumed her. A beam above cracked, falling in a shower of sparks. The roof would not hold much longer. Smoke churned around them, suffocating, pressing Henry's decision to the edge. Mary's hands trembled as she stretched them out again, one alive, one dead. "Choose me, Papa," the voices whispered in unison. "Choose." And then, through the noise, Henry whispered back, almost too softly to hear, "Forgive me." The rifle's crack shattered the farmhouse like thunder. The sound silenced even the mob outside, their chants dying mid-breath as the echo rolled across the Kansas night. Mary's body jerked violently, her small frame thrown backward by the force. For a heartbeat, silence held. Then, her eyes opened one final time. One was Mary's, wide with pain and relief. The other was Clara's, burning with rage. And then, both faded, the glow extinguished, leaving only the dull stillness of death. Henry dropped the rifle, his hands shaking uncontrollably, the metal clattering against the wood floor. His wife screamed, collapsing over their daughter's lifeless body, wailing prayers that burned her throat raw. But Henry knew no prayers could wash the blood from his hands. Above them, the farmhouse gave its last groan as the roof split. Flames surged inward, devouring what little life the house held. Henry grabbed his wife by the arms, dragging her up despite her desperate resistance. She clawed at Mary's body, unwilling to let go, but the heat forced her hand. With tears streaming, she stumbled beside him as he pulled her toward the door. The mob outside parted as Henry emerged, his wife sobbing, his face ashen and hollow. He carried no child. Behind them, the farmhouse collapsed in a thunderous roar, sparks soaring into the night sky like fleeing spirits. For a long moment, the villagers stood silent. The chants, the anger, the calls for fire, gone. All that remained was the crackling ruin of the Whitford home and the image of a father who had sacrificed everything. But among the crowd, whispers began. Some swore they saw a second shadow move in the flames as the roof caved. Others said a small figure had stood in the window, watching with unblinking eyes until the fire swallowed her whole. And some claimed that even as the smoke drifted upward, they could still hear a child's voice on the wind, asking, "Papa, did you choose me?" The ruins of the Whitford farmhouse smoldered for 2 full days, sending bitter black smoke curling into the Kansas sky. By the third morning, only charred beams and ash remained. Henry sat among the wreckage, silent and broken, his face burned and blackened with soot. His wife refused to leave his side, though her eyes were hollow, staring at nothing. The townsfolk kept their distance, whispering as they passed. None dared speak openly to him, for what could be said to a man who had killed his own child? Yet the fire had not destroyed everything. Amid the ash, one thing was discovered untouched: the family photograph. Its edges were scorched, its frame cracked, but the faces within were impossibly clear. Henry, his wife, and little Mary stood frozen in sepia tones, but something was terribly wrong. Where once there had been only 3, there were now 4. Standing just behind Mary, leaning ever so slightly over her shoulder, was a figure. It was faint, blurred as if the camera had not fully caught it, but unmistakable. A child-sized shadow, pale face half-formed, eyes black and bottomless. The photograph passed quickly from hand to hand, every villager desperate to glimpse it. Some swore the shadow's face resembled Clara Whitford, the sister who had died long before. Others whispered that it was not Clara at all, but something older, something that had been waiting for generations. At night, Henry's wife claimed the photo whispered. She said she heard Mary's voice bleeding through the paper, begging, "Let me out." She hid the image in a locked drawer, but by morning it would appear again, propped against the windowsill, staring at their bed. Word of the cursed photograph spread beyond the village within weeks. Travelers carried the story into neighboring towns, and from there, to cities. Soon, newspapers printed lurid accounts. Kansas family photo captures ghostly 4th child. Skeptics called it a trick of the light, a smudge on the lens. Believers whispered of possession, curses, and sins that could not be buried by fire. The photograph became infamous. Some claimed simply looking at it brought misfortune. A farmer who had borrowed it for a night to see the truth lost his entire crop to blight within the week. A woman who gazed at it too long claimed her child fell sick the next day, his eyes flicking strangely in his sleep. The photograph was returned to Henry, who sealed it in a wooden box and buried it deep beneath the burned remains of his home. But that did not silence the whispers. Some said the image changed depending on who looked at it. To some, the 4th figure was Clara. To others, it was Mary herself, smiling faintly with eyes that seemed to move. A few swore they saw both children at once, blended together, their mouths opening in unison. Henry never spoke again of what happened that night. He worked the fields in silence, his wife drifting into madness, her days filled with murmured conversations to no one. By the time of his death, the town had already accepted the story as legend. The Whitford family became a cautionary tale, their name synonymous with the photograph no one dared to keep. And yet, decades later, the image surfaced again. At an estate sale in Topeka, a cracked frame containing the portrait was sold to an unsuspecting collector. When asked later why he bought it, he said, "I couldn't help it." The child in the photo, she moved her eyes. By the turn of the century, the Whitford tragedy had faded into rural folklore. Children dared each other to whisper Mary's name in the cornfields after dark, and elders retold the story of the cursed photograph by lantern light. But most believed the picture had been destroyed, buried with Henry's ruined homestead and left to rot with the ashes of the past. They were wrong. In 1909, nearly 20 years after the fire, the photograph emerged again at an estate sale in Topeka. The buyer, a railway clerk named Samuel Dent, had no knowledge of the Whitfords or their story. He simply thought the faded portrait of a family looked haunting in a beautiful way. He hung it above the fireplace in his modest home, where it quickly became a conversation piece for visitors. Within weeks, however, his wife complained that the photo seemed wrong. At night, when the lamplight flickered across the frame, she swore the smallest figure's eyes darted from one corner of the room to another. Their children refused to enter the parlor after sundown, claiming they heard faint scratching sounds coming from inside the glass. Samuel dismissed these fears as country superstition until the night his youngest son screamed from bed. The boy claimed a little girl had stood in the doorway, smiling, her eyes shining like mirrors. When Samuel checked, the hallway was empty. But the next morning, the family noticed something had changed. In the photograph above the fireplace, Mary Whitford was smiling. News of the Dent family spread quickly. Neighbors reported hearing screams in the night, followed by eerie silence. A traveling preacher claimed the family had been marked by the devil's likeness and urged them to burn the picture. But each time Samuel attempted to remove it, the photograph reappeared in the same spot above the fireplace, as though nailed into the very air. Stranger still, the image itself seemed to evolve. A faint outline of yet another figure began to appear in the background, a second child, smaller than Mary, standing half in shadow. Visitors swore they saw its lips move, though no sound emerged. Tragedy soon followed. Samuel's eldest son was found dead by the tracks near the railway yard, his eyes wide open as if he'd seen something unspeakable in his final moments. His wife fell ill soon after, muttering deliriously about a child in the mirror. By winter, the Dent household was abandoned. When the home was finally repossessed, investigators found the photograph still hanging where it had always been. No amount of force could pry it from the wall. The glass had cracked down the center, but the faces within were sharper than ever. Henry, his wife, Mary, and now two shadowed children staring from behind them. The photograph, it seemed, had no intention of dying with the Whitfords. It had become something else entirely, a vessel, a prison, or worse, a doorway. By the 1920s, the photograph had become a whispered legend across Kansas. Farmers claimed it traveled from house to house on its own, reappearing in barns, schoolhouses, even a church. Families that possessed it rarely lasted long, plagued by accidents, disappearances, or inexplicable deaths. Eventually, local lawmen ordered the photograph locked away in the basement of the county courthouse. For decades, it remained there, hidden in a dusty wooden crate labeled only with a single word, evidence. But history has a way of resurfacing what we most want to forget. In 1957, during renovations, workers stumbled across the crate and pried it open. Inside lay the Whitford portrait, untouched by time. The glass had mended itself, the frame gleamed as though freshly polished. And yet, the faces inside were not the same. Henry Whitford and his wife were gone. Their chairs were empty. Only the children remained. Mary, the faint shadow child beside her, and something new. A third figure, taller, with its face obscured, loomed in the background like a phantom parent returned to claim its family. One of the workers, unnerved but fascinated, took a Polaroid snapshot of the photograph. When the film developed, the image had changed again. The three figures were no longer inside the portrait. They were standing behind the worker himself, eyes glistening, mouths curved into ghastly smiles. He never returned to the courthouse. Today, no one is certain where the Whitford photograph resides. Some say it was quietly destroyed by the county years ago. Others insist it was stolen during the courthouse fire of 1974. But in certain circles, collectors of haunted artifacts, historians of rural Americana, the rumor persists that the photograph still circulates, passed hand to hand, never staying with one family for too long. Those who claim to have seen it describe similar details. Mary Whitford's piercing eyes, the growing number of shadow children, and the tall, faceless figure watching from the rear. Some even report that the children's eyes no longer remain fixed within the frame. Instead, they follow you, across the room, into the hall, sometimes into your dreams. Urban legend or not, there is one detail no one disputes. Every time the photograph resurfaces, tragedy follows. Families vanish, houses burn, graves are dug, and the cycle repeats. Perhaps the most unsettling claim of all came in 1992, when a farmer's wife in rural Kansas swore that she saw the photo hanging in her neighbor's house. When she asked him where he got it, the man stared at her blankly. He insisted he had never owned such a picture. But days later, when the house went up in flames, firefighters swore they saw a charred frame lying in the ashes, its glass unbroken, its faces sharper than ever. And if the rumors are true, the photograph has not yet finished its journey. Some say it may even be closer than you think. Today, no one is certain where the Whitford photograph resides. Some say it was quietly destroyed by the county years ago. Others insist it was stolen during the courthouse fire of 1974. But in certain circles, collectors of haunted artifacts, historians of rural Americana, the rumor persists that the photograph still circulates, passed hand to hand, never staying with one family for too long. Those who claim to have seen it describe similar details. Mary Whitford's piercing eyes, the growing number of shadow ch.